I remember plugging into it the first time and like hearing how loud it was and how full it was, and I was thinking, wow.
What's up, you guys? How's it going? Alright, just gonna scoop that in there. Okay. The Mesa Rectifier. This thing is easily one of the most recognizable amps ever made. Look, you're probably thinking one of two things right now. Either you already know what this thing sounds like, or maybe you're just hoping that as soon as I'm done with this video, I take this thing straight to the dumpster. Either way, there's a lot more to this amp than meets the eye. And the different tones and feels that it pulls off still to this day continue to surprise me. So in this video, we'll take a listen to how this amp sounds, talk about its history and why it's so special to music, and by the end of this, give you a much better idea of the sweet and sensitive beast that hides behind this shiny diamond plate. So, let's go. What's up, everybody? How's it going? I'm Brad Dollar. Welcome to the channel. It's great to see you. Before we get going, if you can do me a huge favor and hit the subscribe and the like button, I'd super appreciate that. It does a ton to help me grow the channel by knowing what you like, so thank you so much for doing that. The Mesa Rectifier. As an electric guitar player, there's just something about how Mesa amps respond to guitar playing, especially the ones that are in the same lineage as the rectifiers. The responsiveness, the tightness in the bottom end, the crispy but not too chimey top end, and some of the most headroom and volume that you can experience on any amp. And all of that is true about the crunch and the overdrive from this amp, as well as the clean channel. Something that's definitely often overlooked. Now, I might be a fanboy just because this amp is the sound of my youth. Across the board then and still to this day, some of my favorite music is made with rectifiers. Whether you love Dave Grohl or Metallica, Tom DeLonge, Tool, or The Offspring, and all of the punk rock and hardcore bands over the years that no matter how small or terrible the acoustics are in a place, when they plug into one of these things, everything sounds heavy and awesome. It's all these different experiences with both playing through this amp and hearing it on so many records that makes it so fun and invigorating to play through. And as a result, it gives you room to start exploring all kinds of different sounds. It's not just one distorted and one clean sound that this thing does. Especially versions of the rectifier like I have, where both channels of the amp have different voicings for how they actually sound, which instantly expand the tonal palette of this amp. A rectifier, no matter if it's a single, dual, or triple, is one of the most flexible amps ever made. And even if you were to put that aside, the thing that it's known for, it is exceptionally great at. It's one of the few amps where you can get everything you need, any tone from light overdrive to just heavy all-out wall of distortion, without needing any pedals or really anything else except your guitar. And some riffs. So let's talk a little bit about where this amp comes from. Now, if you're not familiar with the Mesa Boogie history, definitely do a deep dive and check them out, but essentially the story goes something like this. Mesa, or Mesa Boogie, was founded by Randall Smith. His main job was fixing up amps at a local music store, but he got known around town for being the guy who could hot rod amps and make them sound a lot more distorted and overdriven and just, way more rock and roll for the time.
It started with playing a joke on Barry Melton, which was, can you boost this amp? Jacked it up a little bit more than that. It was a killing amp. It was undeniable.
Keep in mind that even into the late 60s, a lot of music gear manufacturers thought of distortion as like a bad word. That wasn't something that you wanted your amps to have. That wasn't something you wanted your guitars to be able to produce. But as the sound of fuzz took off, and musicians turning their amplifiers up as loud as they could go to get that sound in the first place, or even like the Beatles did, started punching holes in the speakers to make it more crispy and more gritty, there was a huge opening for amps to have that kind of sound coming right off them, for amps to be able to produce that kind of distorted, overdriven sound all by themselves. And that's what Randall was fascinated with, modding these old Fender amps to make them overdrive as quickly and as much as possible. And that began his career as the amp guy. That was the beginning of Mesa Boogie.
Well, our third big impact on popular music and guitar playing came about from the dual rectifier. We thought, okay, let's take this even further out.
Now, I'm no electronics wizard, but it's worth talking about what a rectifier is as far as it relates to guitar amps. A rectifier is basically a building block of all power supplies. Rectifiers help take AC voltage, which is what's coming off your wall, and turns it into DC voltage, which makes the amp work.
Oh, and by the way, there was that other thing about the dual rectifier tubes that enabled two different styles and feels of response from the amplifier.
On paper, this sounds like a bad idea because it basically slows the voltage down. It causes it to sag a little bit. That somehow makes you feel even more connected to the parts you're playing, especially as you saturate it. And then as far as rectification or that sound relates to the different models of Mesa rectifiers like the single, dual, and triple, the single rectifier breaks up a little earlier and is maybe a little tighter at lower volumes. The dual and triple rectifiers do sound better at louder volumes. amps. But there are different nuances between each one. Not to mention all the different versions and revisions of the amps themselves. There have been a bunch of different iterations, with things like power soaks built in to make it operate at lower wattage, to the ability to switch back and forth between different kinds of rectification. But no matter which one you pick, they all have that very spongy, crunchy, chunky flavor that it's known for. And that makes it super fun to play through. Alright, that's enough yakking, let's get down to how this thing actually sounds. As far as the setup here, to show you what I mean, how flexible and awesome this amp is, I'm actually going to make it a little difficult for this amp to shine. Here's what I mean. Firstly, I won't be using a cab or a real speaker. Instead, I'll be using the 2 Notes captor in the 8-ohm version. And then for a speaker emulation, I'll use their Torpedo software with the BHG87 4x12. It sounds nice and worn in and real. And then on top of that, I'm going to use a guitar that people don't often use with this amp, and that's a Fender Telecaster. The rectifier definitely shines with a humbuckered guitar playing through it. But even with the somewhat shrill and brittle nature of a Telecaster, it's able to tame all of that down and still wake up all this heaviness inside of it. Which when you put all that together actually makes for a very satisfying guitar track in a mix. Loud, chunky, distorted, but not in the way. But even with those things stacked against it, this thing still shines. So without further ado, let's go. All right, we're hooked up. Just this one cable, the Telecaster, and that's it. Let's go. Hopefully you're not here for a guitar lesson. If you are, definitely do another YouTube search. Otherwise, let's get right down into it. I'm going to start on channel 2, which is the heavier gain channel. This channel has a raw, vintage, and modern voice to it, but you can select between. The raw is the least amount of overdrive and distortion, kind of just sounds like an old amp. Vintage is a lot closer to like how a Marshall sounds. And then modern is just straight up rectifier goodness. All right, so this is the modern setting. It's kind of what you expect from a rectifier. It's got that very textbook heavy rock sound, and it's doing it with basically everything kind of like in the middle on the amp. There's not a whole lot of the EQ being boosted or cut anywhere. That said, what I love about this amp is actually how flexible the EQ is. I do notice that when I use it with the 2 Notes captor with the load box, that it's a little less sensitive than when you're plugged into an actual speaker cabinet. But nonetheless, any little change to any of the knobs actually makes a big difference in how it sounds. All right, here's the vintage voicing. As you switch back and forth between the channels, you're definitely gonna have to play with the EQ and the gain a little bit to make it just exactly right. So all around, just like a little thicker, it's just a little less rectifier-y. This is much closer to what it sounds like with like a Marshall, for example, like a JCM 800 or something, which is great because then you can layer your guitars with this amp. You can do one track with the modern voicing, flip over to the vintage voicing, do your second take, and then you have basically like 2 amps and you're doing the whole Jerry Finn thing where it's a Marshall and a Mesa together. It's not as bright as something like a Plexi, for example, but on the vintage voicing, it does have a little bit of that British low-end rumble to it. If you guys are liking this video so far, please hit subscribe and like. It helps the channel a ton. All right, and while we're here, let's check out what the voicing of the raw channel sounds like. Now, this one is the most different out of any channel setting on this amp. It's sort of between everything. And this would be a great setting to use if you wanted to use a lot of pedals in front of this amp. Otherwise, I think the other two, vintage and modern, would just get a little overloaded a little too quickly, which of course can be a cool sound in and of itself. But here's the raw channel. It's probably going to be a little dark, so we'll go ahead and boost a little bit of the presence. I don't know if this is an accurate term, but it's like late stage saturation or something. It's not as crispy and as distorted on the very front part of the signal. All right, great. Now let's do the clean channel. We'll start in its standard voicing. Sweet, now let's hear the push side of the clean channel, which is the correct name for this voicing because it's basically the sound of a clean amp pushed as far as it can go. Let's take a listen. Alright, yes, this thing is awesome! God, I love this amp. It's so fun to play through, it records super well, constantly surprises me, does it all for my heart and my soul. What I want to get across about this amp in particular is that a lot of people don't dig deep enough into the things they have around them. So I encourage you to keep exploring the gear that you have, and also try new stuff. You might be surprised. Remember that with music, there are no rules, only possibilities. And all of this stuff are just tools. The most important thing you can do is make music with whatever you have. Thanks so much for watching. I hope this video was helpful. I hope it gave you a better idea of what the Mesa Rectifier can do and inspires you to explore the gear you have around you, or maybe explore some new gear. And drop a comment below of what your favorite amp is or what your favorite experience of the rectifier is, because I'd love to hear it. Until next time, thanks so much.